Welcome to AI Horizons, the video series where we illuminate the future of AI. We bring together the brightest minds to share deep insights and practical advice on AI and work. I'm Pham, the Vice President of AI at Workday, and I am so thrilled to be joined by Reggie Townsend, the Vice President of the SAS Data Ethics Practice and a member of the National AI Advisory Committee here in the United States. Together, we're going to dive into what it takes to build AI agents, how to really harness all the potential and honor the complex realities of human and machine connections. Let's dive right in. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I know we've been trying to do this for a while, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, you're one of the first people I immediately thought of when we thought about a series and thinking about the future of AI, work, and the responsibility we have and when we're building technology.
Yep.
You've been a part of some of the most significant companies of our time, IBM, Sun, SAS, ones that have really driven the future of enterprise and the future of work. Can you share a little bit about how you've seen technology evolve, especially into the landscape that we see today with AI?
Yeah, how they say the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Hmm.
I think that that's true in technology as well. Back, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, Kathy, but when I was early in my career, doing work at Motorola, working on mobile phones, like the very first cell phones that were coming off the lines. That work was really all about getting people to communicate with other people, not within their proximity. Later, you go to Sun Microsystems and we're building out the internet, and that was about getting people to communicate, but through this thing called internet and World Wide Web and what have you. And then you fast forward another 15, 20 years from there, and you start dealing with social networks, and it's still about getting people to connect. And so I think at the end of the day, at least as far as the part of the horizon that I've been able to see, technology has always been about enabling our values, one of which is to get us to connect in more meaningful ways, more impactful ways.
I'm struck as you were talking about just even through the evolution of technology, how deep human connection and communication is such a big part of that. So just in the last few years, we've seen the evolution of technology and specifically AI with large language models and generative AI. And you've been at the forefront of a lot of those conversations, especially with the human and connection and communication component as well. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see the shift with AI, specifically with agentic AI, and what that means for the connection between technology and people and how we communicate and work with each other?
It's a fascinating time to be a part of the tech space now, because we're going from kind of the human connection part, at least that I was able to witness with things like mobile phones and what have you, to now human to machine and potentially machine to machine, with agents. And I think the big questions that have to be asked and answered are still very ambiguous to us. Like, what should the experience be like human to quote unquote machine, right? When should we know that it's a machine or AI that we're interacting with, and when should we not? When should we give complete autonomy to an agent to act on our behalf? When should we not? When can an agent delegate to other agents or delegate to other humans, right? These are slowly, maybe really fast becoming questions that we need to answer. So I think the peculiarity here, so far as I'm concerned from an ethics perspective, is whose value sets then get propagated through these networks that we're starting to create as we look at human to machine and machine to human sorts of dynamics.
Let's talk about that too then, as we think about the value sets and these different shifts that we've seen. And you're in such a fascinating and interesting position because you've seen mobile transitions, you've seen the cloud transition. Now we're looking at the AI transition. How should organizations think about their operational context in terms of adopting any new technology, especially with agentic AI and all the different versions you've just mentioned?
So, first of all, I would tell everyone to take a beat, right? I think
Mhm.
those of us who are in the tech space, arguably, we're a bit far over our skis with the conversation and the suggestion that people are ready to adopt all of this stuff. In fact, I would argue that most organizations are not ready to adopt a lot of what we're trying to sell. And obviously, it is in my interest to try to sell stuff, right, as a software company at SAS. That said, the reality is, I get a chance to talk to folks that just came back from Europe, talking to a collection of customers. A lot of folks are still trying to get their heads wrapped around how to bring a large language model into the enterprise and make it useful as a part of a normal productive workflow for their people. Right. So let's just realize that as a reality. Now, that's going to happen. And then the next logical step is, and at least so far as we're designing it, is okay, now LLM becomes quote unquote brain, and now we start to have some tentacles, if you will, that we call agents that go off and do things, coming back to consult the brain from time to time. Organizations have to realize that before getting into the technology discussion, they have to consider the organizational and operational impacts of the technology. I say often, if you want to be trustworthy with AI, it's got to start before the first line of code shows up, right? So that means you've got to make sure that you've got adequate amounts of oversight in place and have a general sense for how you're going to adopt these technologies, how those technologies align with the strategy of the organization, making sure that you've got adequate data strategy in place, all those sorts of things up front. Secondly, you got to think about the operational context here. So, what's the enabling infrastructure that will be required in order to adopt some of these capabilities? A lot of
Mhm.
organizations are not currently constructed, just from an org design perspective, to think differently about how they absorb the technology, how they skill and reskill their people, divisional layouts, all those sorts of things are very, very important. We haven't even gotten to the compliance side of the house. So depending on which kind of industry you're in, especially those highly regulated industries, your rate of adoption of this technology is going to be directly impacted by your ability to get it past regulators. And then the fourth pillar here that I think often gets overlooked is culture. All right. A lot of cultures are not prepared to accept fast moving capabilities like AI and agentic AI, largely because the people are resistant, right? So imagine, as a leader, you show up and you say, "Hey, everybody, I had this great idea. We're going to bring this technology. It's called AI. It's going to make us be, more productive. We're going to optimize decisions and these sorts of things." What's the first thing that people hear? Tech is coming, it's going to take my job, and there's nothing I can do about it. The rate of slow adoption that I'm hearing, just coming back from Europe, talking to some different companies, is real. And largely that's a function of trust. And it means that leaders have to start to embody first and then imbue second trust in the organization that says, we're going to bring this stuff in, but it's not here to threaten you. And that is a major task right now that that folks are talking about in C-suites and boards.
Every time I hear you talk, you give me so much more to think about, and I'm so grateful for that. And also speaking to my own heart, it's so great to hear software companies talk about, "Hey, you actually might not be ready." And then let me help you figure out how to get there. So you've touched on oversight, adoption, data strategy, infrastructure, regulation, culture. These are pretty common practices in software development in general. What is it about this moment we have with automation and AI and agents that make these different? So let's just take one, for example. Let's talk about oversight and culture. What makes this different versus traditional software development?
As a term, AI means a lot of things to different people, right? Some think it's just a chatbot, right? Some say AI is the Terminator coming, right? But anecdotally, whenever I talk to lay folks who aren't steeped into this space, within a minute or two, I usually get some fear-based response, right? And you just try it next time you're in an Uber, right? And just having a conversation. There's usually some sort of fear or concern. Now, we can say that's a function of a lot of things. Hollywood over the years, maybe the tour that folks went on after large language models became part of the lexicon, and people start talking about existential risk and all this sort of stuff. Like none of that helped, right? But there is a broad base, I find, and it's a global effect when it comes to distrust. And in fact, Edelman does this trust survey on an annual basis. So in their 2025 version of the survey, they say 37% of respondents trust AI to be fair and unbiased. That means 2/3 of people don't. Just think about that. They say 29% believe that the current AI governance structures are adequate. That means 70% don't. And so we can't act like people who are experiencing this in their consumer lives, let's call it, right, or their personal lives, just completely do away with those thoughts when they walk into the office. Right? It just doesn't happen. So you have people who are coming into the office with these same thoughts in mind, right? So when I address um, professional audiences and I talk to them about what's going on in this space, and I ask for a raising of the hands around people who might have some concerns about their very jobs, those hands go up, right? So there's a real concern here. So I think that we just have to acknowledge that at this particular point in time, and I don't know that it's just unique to this particular technology, but giving the accumulation of the historical context, the specific technology, and how it makes us feel, and what we're seeing in terms of how folks are reacting. I think it's just a combination of all of those that make this particular time feel a lot more unique.
That's such an important point to bring up, where we're at a technology where people are familiar with it in our personal lives. It probably more so than other technology, and then we go into the office and we see it show up again in the office space,
Mhm.
and to not be able to turn that off, right? And to be able to have those conversations of reassurance and trust in the context of work, because we're experiencing it in our personal lives, and how to reconcile that.
Yeah. Now, we have parallels here. Probably the most recent ubiquitous parallel would be the internet. So remember when the internet was coming online, particularly e-commerce as an example, there were a lot of people who were saying, "You want me to put my credit card where in this computer, and what's going to happen?" Like that was a significant issue, right? But now, look at 2024. You've got trillions of dollars going through e-commerce. It takes time, so we have to acknowledge that. And right now, there certainly feels like a rush to move really fast. And I just think the rate of adoption, that the capacity of people to first understand and then accept and then incorporate is much slower than a lot of us might suggest that it is.
Mhm. You brought up a bit about data, and you lead the data ethics practice at SAS, and then you've also been doing this work for so long as well. How do you see companies talking about data to then reconcile any concerns employees might have, or really reconciling the workplace with what they might see in their personal lives? How do you see the conversation about data evolving?
Honestly, I don't see a lot of companies talking about data as it relates to kind of that personal component, other than to say, don't use our data, our company data, and put it in,
Mhm.
a popular large language model in order to be more productive at work. And so part of the rush, candidly, toward adopting AI in some organizations is more of a hedge. It's a defensive strategy to say people are using it, particularly younger employees, right? New generation coming in with a lot more familiarity with the tools, have an interest in using some of these capabilities. And so rather than having them potentially compromise the organization, let's figure out how to get the organization equipped with the tools necessary to give them that same capability without, potentially disclosing confidential information.
Mhm. That's such an important question so many organizations are grappling with. How do we empower the employees with the tools to be able to use at work without compromising any of the issues that a company cares about, um, when the employees are already using some of these tools in their personal lives?
Mm. Yep. Yep. It's real. It's,
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
just with an organization here last week, and they they have a demographic um, breakout in terms of both familiarity and comfort with AI. When you look at the more senior part of their organization, that populace, there's less familiarity and less comfort. When you look at the younger part, kind of the Gen Z and slightly above millennials, there's a lot more comfort and familiarity, and those are the folks who are pressing the organization to bring some of these tools in order to bolster their productivity.
Let's talk about infrastructure. How do you see infrastructure evolving right now to meet the moment we're in with building AI systems, especially with agentic AI? And you mentioned earlier, not just human and machine, but now maybe machine and machine connections. How do you see that evolving?
So I think that answer kind of depends on where you are on the globe, to be honest with you. So if we take just a U.S. centric approach, I think a couple things. One, there is a significant reliance on hyperscalers, and we see a relative comfort for most organizations to move toward the cloud, right, which is the domain of these hyperscalers. Now, which one you choose is usually, a matter of comfort and relationship that a CIO might have. I think multi-cloud kind of mobility will become increasingly a concern. And we're seeing in our business, at least, an interest in repatriation of data back to the on-prem, and that's largely a function of the cost of egress from the cloud, right? And so we see those dynamics. So I think by and large, that regime will maintain itself. Where it gets really interesting is when you get outside of the US, because when you start thinking about the concentration of business data, if you, let's say you're a European company or an Asian company, you start thinking about the concentration of business data and, by the way, consumer and personal data uh, riding on the infrastructure of US based companies. The data sovereignty question becomes very pronounced, right? And when you consider that a lot of our economies, plural, are beginning to platform, which means you have a reliance on infrastructures like what the hyperscalers offer, um, it becomes a matter of concern. I don't want to go so far as to say national security. I think that's an overused term, but you start to certainly head in that direction. And so, what happens if, let's say, you're a leader of a nation and most of your nation is relying on Microsoft or Amazon, and you know they decide, or our government decides for them that they need to, open up certain data or shut down certain pipes in order for companies or consumers to have access. Those are concerns, and they're legitimate concerns. And so that's why I say it kind of depends on where you are. And this is, I think, also why you start to see some nations really invest in infrastructure of their own in order to shore up, kind of hedge their bets as it relates to over reliance on U.S. based firms.
So, building on that global infrastructure conversation, how does compliance globally fit into that?
Well, some might argue that the EU AI Act, as an example, was a defensive hedge because of this very reason, right? Maybe that's part of it. I don't know that that's 100% the reason why, but certainly I think it is part of the logic. As a consequence, we're seeing other um, AI regulatory regimes pop up. South Korea just, did theirs. UK is kind of taking a tepid approach. Australia is doing work. So as an organization, so as a leader in a company, I've got to be concerned about how I operate in all of these nations. Of course, my interest is in making sure that there's some level of standardization so that I can be able to operate globally without a tremendous amount of change. And so, yeah, the compliance matter it's an evolving area, but one where we're seeing some manner of consistency. We kind of see the EU AI Act right now as a, if you will, a high water mark, and we'll see what happens with the other regimes around the world.
Hmm. Building on that, recognizing that ethics and compliance can be different or are different, how should our organizations consider data ethics in both the scenario where we're building technology and the scenario where we're buying technology? What should be our model for thinking through data ethics?
So first of all, I think that it's important to break that down, the term down, right? So if I might, I see data really as kind of our recorded experience, right? It's the bits and bytes of our lives. So pardon me, I'll get philosophical here for a second. And then I see the ethics piece as social consensus. And so when you combine that, it's like, what do we want to do with our recorded experience, and what does society consider okay, right? What are we willing to accept? So if we accept that our bits and bytes, our recorded experience is reflective of all of who we are, the good and bad and the ugly. And now we're going to use those bits and bytes, we call them data, and use that data to inform models that perform automated decisions on our behalf that we call AI. Are we prepared to accept the output of that? Are we prepared to exercise judgment over that? Or we just accept it as it is and we are biased toward the automation? These are all contemporary questions, and these are all the questions that have to be asked and answered organization by organization. So when we at SAS decided we wanted to go down this journey, the first place we started was, well, we've got to really put a set of principles in place, because just setting up rules all over the place won't work. And so we started first and foremost with the principle of human centricity. And so that everything that we do, we want to make sure that it's in service of humans. And the way that translates to us is that we want to make sure that everything that we do is helping humans to thrive and is helping to avoid harm. So in other words, we're focused on human agency, equity, and well-being, right? That was our focus. Now, if you go and talk to other organizations, they might have a similar principle, but it's going to mean something different to them, right? If you're a consumer-facing organization, human centricity means something a whole lot different than it does to me in a B2B context, right? And so while we can use the same words, the context and the culture shape those words, right? So that becomes really important. So that would be my first order of business that I would instruct to every organization. Get aligned on your principles and know what they really mean for you. But then you've got to make the critical hop, principles to practice, right? And that's where a lot of folks get stuck, because that's what that's where the hard work starts, right? Which is, all right, let's now peer into our organization and be prepared to change. And unfortunately, there is a lot of rigidity, and I understand why. There's a lot of rigidity in organizations, right? This is what we do. We have to do it this way. And there's a lot of either flat out resistance or certainly inertia when it comes to making changes, even if it's to be consistent with who we say we are.
Yeah.
And so therein lies the rub, right? And those are leadership choices. At the end of the day, those are leadership choices. And so I was fortunate enough to be, at SAS at a time when we've got an executive leadership team that's responsive to these ideas. We've got a CEO who is responsive to these ideas and give me the autonomy then to go into the organization and not force change, but to influence where appropriate the change that's necessary.
Yeah. I hear you so much on the principles to practice and how incredible it is when there's leadership that understands how to take those principles to practice. And I'll also ready take I will sign up for any philosophical session with Reggie Townsend any day. So your personal background
Hmm.
spans electronics engineering, business, advising governments. And it's so clear when you talk about these topics, you're able to really see a breadth that can help bring together what we actually should build and how and which components need to fit together. Can you share a little bit for the folks who might not be able to span so many different groups? And you also bring in the humanities into this, right? Like the human-centric part of it, and you pair all that together. Can you share a bit for the folks who might not get to span all these different sectors, how you've seen effectively bridging these different groups from engineering and business and government and the humanities and social science all together to really drive a business forward in a really responsible way?
You know what? I'll try.
Mhm.
There are some things that we all do intuitively because we're just wired that way, and then there's some things that we have to do intentionally because we learn the skill. Um, Connecting dots and seeing bridges has always been an intuitive act for me, and having comfort and courage in different spaces and environments has again always just kind of come natural to me. So I don't know entirely how to explain it, but I'll say this: I've learned technique, meaning when I'm in different spaces, I'm much more apt to listen than I am to talk. And when I listen and observe, it gives me an opportunity to just kind of listen for the things that I already know so that I can make connection. Like, so I'm going to hear things that I don't know for sure. But just as an observer and put myself intentionally in different spaces enough, I'm able to observe commonalities. And so once I see commonalities, that's what I hold on to. And then just having, the gift of communicating, I'm able to share with people, hey, did you understand that what you just said is very similar to what they're doing in this other industry? And maybe there's a tie there. And so again, part of that is just straight up gift and intuition. I don't know where it came from. So I'm not gonna lie to you here. But then the other part is a little bit of technique after having learned that I have that ability, right?
Maybe a different version of that same question is, because you have these gifts to navigate these spaces, what are some examples where you were in a government setting, in a business setting, in an engineering setting, and you were able to see, oh, there's a bridge here, where our peers sometimes, because I also love navigating between these different settings, right? Where our peers in one group might not be able to see the commonality with the other side. So engineering might not see how policy and compliance and governments might connect, or business might not see, why engineer wants to use these models to build something or some version of that. Is there an example where you're like, oh, because we move between these spaces, there's like, what's like a connection you've been able to see?
I'll give you a very recent one. I can disclose, but it was at a military installment, and having the ability to kind of see that space for what it was, and with the individual I was speaking with, was able to draw a lot of parallels to the enterprise, and you could literally see light bulbs go off, where it's like, ah, yeah, although we think we're specialized because we have obviously a very special mission, much of what they were doing was very consistent with, you know, any old company USA, right? And so just being able to show that, there's value that, I could bring from a conversation standpoint, was, I think, it was very elucidating to this
Mhm.
individual.
That's great. That's a great example. Thank you. All right, we'll have two more questions and we
Okay.
can wrap up. Let's bring it back to AI agents. How do we see right now the conversation of value and purpose as you bring in this new wave of technology being generative AI, agents, agent to agent, and beyond? How do we think about value and purpose at a time like this? What are some frameworks we might be able to rely on? What kinds of questions should we ask? What does that look like?
So I have an ethical inquiry framework that I like to rely on during times of ambiguity, like what we're dealing with agentic AI. And it's three very simple questions. For what purpose, to what end, and for whom might it fail? So in other words, the for what purpose is the why. Why is this important? For whom is it important? Right? And what are they trying to accomplish? Right? The to what end really is a measurement. It's a criteria to say, we can pursue this path, but where are we headed, right? And is the destination worth the energy that it takes to get there?
Hmm.
More cynically, is the destination worth the harm that might result as a consequence of getting there, right? And again, you can't overlook the last question, which is for whom might it fail? Especially in our tech space, we tend to have, and I love it, innovative, creative, grandiose ideas that are fueled by optimism. I love that. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that we live in an ecosystem where there are people who may not benefit as much as we might envision, and there are people who will absolutely be hurt. And so, is the destination worth that harm? But the two don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a binary choice. What I would recommend is pursue the end goal for the most vulnerable. Because when you solve for the issues of the most vulnerable, guess what? Everybody else is usually okay. But oftentimes we find that we want to go fast, go far, and we leave so many people behind.
Hmm.
And to me, that's just, morality aside, it's bad business, right?
Yeah.
You can make fast money, quick money, but you can't make long money that way. And you can't make sustainable money that way because you're
Yeah.
going to just go and grab a few who can do. And so I'd say build business. When we start thinking about this agentic work, let's build business that is going to be sustainable.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing I want to say, like, the notion of agents isn't It's not a new construct. But what is new is now we're taking the notion of agent and we're embedding it in technology, right? So as currently constructed, like our agency law is built around the idea of humans. And it's built around the idea that I can assign you my agency and you can go and act on my behalf based on what I assign you to do, right? Say if I'm an athlete, you can go and negotiate a contract for me. It's also built around the idea of alignment, meaning that if you are acting on my behalf, maybe you are a sports agency and you can get other people within your organization to work on my behalf, but we're aligned that way. You can delegate, but we're aligned. I'm still the principal, but we're aligned. Final piece is the incentive structures, right? As an agent, you're going to get a percentage of that contract, and that is in your best interest, is in my best interest. If you violate the terms of agency, I can penalize you by going to a different agency, right? So we've got this human understanding of reward and penalty that's built into our current structure. Mm-hmm. Here's what's different, Kathy. When we go into a technology arrangement with agency, we can probably get assignment figured out, right? I can assign an agent to do something, but where it gets tricky is when that agent starts to act autonomously and needs to invoke another agent. So if you will delegate, what guarantees do I have that that other agent that has been delegated to also has my best interest at heart, right? Because that agent might have been created by you or someone else, and it is already optimized to perform consistent with that principle, right? So we've got to figure out that agent to agent piece, and not to mention multiple agents within a particular contract. And right now, the conversation is we can make an agent go do this, and then it can do that, and then it can work 8 hours a day. No, not yet. We're not there. But then the last and final piece is the incentive structure. How can I penalize an agent with money? Right? The AI agent is ready to work 24 hours a day. It knows no reward really, other than what, maybe a thumbs up, you did the right thing. So there's a reinforcement piece of that. And so we have to really think long and hard about how much autonomy we're prepared to give agents for certain tasks. Because if the alignment piece isn't there, something can go really wrong, right? And so again, I just think, as I started at the very beginning of this, I think we're a bit over our skis on some of the agentic conversation. We'll get there. I think it's healthy to have this kind of conversation, healthy to have this kind of contemplation. But there's certain things that we should be talking about and envisioning. There are other things that we should be selling. and they don't always meet.
Those are such powerful reminders of agency and autonomy and really understanding what those words mean today and historically. And then working with our most vulnerable populations for a sustainable future and business. You mentioned a framework you've used. We recently actually talked internally with our teams, and one of our amazing product leaders, Genders, released a piece recently about the curb cut effect and bringing that into AI development. So the idea that when we build curves, we also have a curb cut to handle accessibility and how that's useful for so many others. And we've also brought up the accessibility framework of permanent, temporal, and situational, as well as we think about, again, AI and different populations we have to serve. What other frameworks do you rely on or use that other folks here might find useful to refer to or use as reference?
I really lead with the ethical inquiry piece. I've got some other frameworks that are more associated with trustworthy AI governance and so on. I talked about the piece earlier. At SAS, we refer to it as the quad, where we're focused on oversight, operations, compliance, and culture. So that's one framework. And then there's a technology layer associated with that, where we really basically what we're saying is there are 6 core capabilities necessary in order to demonstrate AI in a trustworthy manner. They're focused on things like data management. So if you believe, say, that data, which we do, data is kind of the core to all of this. You've got to have adequate data management capabilities in place. That data has got to be properly explained, particularly once that gets into models. So the explanation then is the second piece in that framework. You've got to have the ability to detect potential harm, so detect biases of all sorts. So that's the third. Obviously, data then has to be necessarily private and secure. So that's the fourth, and the fifth is mitigation. So once you've been able to identify breaches on privacy and security, breaches on detection, you've got to be able to have some mitigating forces in place. Then the final sixth piece is a model ops piece where we really get into the heart of governance. And so a lot of my time these days has really been focused on AI governance.
Great. Thank you
Yeah.
for those resources. What opportunities do you look forward to when you think about agentic AI and the technology that is underlying all of this?
Well, at the core of this is the democratization of powerful capability. Um, and we just did a big, had an announcement with the Commonwealth not so long ago. And the idea behind that was to extend AI capacity to people who are in situations, many, not because of their own failure, but because of history that has put their nations in such a way that they've not been able to build their economies. And so, if you think about AI as a democratizing force, one that will allow people to build new economies, it only makes sense for us to extend, we think anyway, it only makes sense to extend some of that capacity to those kinds of nations. And so what gives me hope, Kathy, is that um, not only nations like that, but even here at home, communities from where I come from, you put capabilities into the hands of people who are able to express themselves in ways that are entrepreneurial, that are creative, that are artistic, um, with a low barrier to entry, right? So if you think about just programming, in order to get into this space that we call AI, or to get into even prior, when we were just kind of dealing with the web and social and all the rest of it, one needed to go to college, right? One needed to learn a language and then get a job to go and do this work, or to start a business and all those sorts of things. Imagine now using English as the language for coding, right? And just saying, I have something in my mind that I've conjured up, and I can speak it into existence with the help of some AI. That's tremendous. Like I'm not a good drawer, right? I didn't get that artistic skill, but I have a lot of pictures in my head that I can draw. They just don't translate to my hand very well. And so the ability to speak that into existence is powerful. And so I have hope that we can extend hope to those who have all of those ideas in their own minds about things that they can do, um, except that they don't have either access or tools. So if we can lower the barrier to access and provide them some tools, I think we'll set ourselves up for a tremendous
Yeah,
future that is extremely inclusive of all the people who otherwise have been left out.
I hear you so much on that democratization of technology where the technology can unblock those barriers that we've put in place to enter something, and that so many people have the skills and the version of those skills they have, but they might lack the language that is dominant in that region, or they might lack a certain capability and being able to recognize how talented folks are. What is a thought you would like to leave people with as they go forth in their day and think about how AI either shows up or should show up in the workplace?
One thing that I would leave with people, Kathy, is a phrase I like to use, which is responsible innovation starts with responsible innovators. And I happen to believe that we are all innovators. We all have the ability to affect change. I happen to believe that we all care about something. And to me, that's our responsibility. It's our duty to care. And so I encourage all of us, people who listen to podcasts like yours, who are in the enterprise, to see themselves as responsible innovators. And in so doing, as we are innovating, use that ethical inquiry that I described earlier. For what purpose, to what end, for whom might it fail? I think if we can orient ourselves around doing what's ultimately in the best interest of our businesses, because we're doing what's in the best interest of those who are most vulnerable, that not only will we build sustainable businesses, but we will make the world a much friendlier place on which to live.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Reggie.
It was a lot of fun, Kathy. It was good to see you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of AI Horizons. If you'd like to learn more about agentic AI, check out our AI Masterclass series at workday.com/AI-masterclass.